You are listening to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast. My name is Tom Argersinger and I'm your host. And this is my co-host, Kelly Allen. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Tom. On the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, we explore how we as Jesus followers can connect the dots between education, culture, and biblical theology and live like Jesus in a broken and challenging world. And tonight, this is actually a night podcast. We are so excited because we have a panel of guests with us.
Wow.
And we're going to be talking about emotional health and kids and teens.
That is great. Yes. So glad you guys are all here. Welcome.
We're so happy to have you.
Glad you're here.
Yes.
So I think we're going to meet some of these folks.
Yes, we are. But I want to say to everybody who's listening and everybody who's in our audience, we actually have a live audience in front of us this evening. I want to tell everybody that we're not going to go over full bios of everybody on stage with us today, but if you want to look in the show notes, then you'll see everything about everybody that we're talking to tonight. But all of you are very qualified to talk about mental and emotional health. And so I want to start with Dr. Keezer. Dr. Keezer, can you tell us what your particular specialty and focus demographic is in mental health and emotional health?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work for the U.S. Army right now. Previously, I worked with teenagers in Chicago. While I was getting my doctorate, I was also a licensed counselor during that time. So that's what I did in my previous life, was working primarily with teenagers in outside Chicago. So now I primarily do therapy and psychological testing with adults, the soldiers, in an environment that's focused primarily on aviation. So I also do a lot of aviation evals for pilots and other air crew.
Wow.
And Dr. Keezer is working with the 82nd Airborne. I think that's right.
Indeed, yes. And as I mentioned, I know it's always a formality, but even though I do work for the U.S. Army, everything I share today is just my own opinion and doesn't represent anything that the U.S. Army or the U.S. government officially believes by policy. So I want to clarify that as well.
Very good. We got it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for being here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Ms. Wolfkill, I want to ask you the same thing. What is your particular specialty in mental emotional health?
Well, I'm assistant principal at secondary for Community Christian School, and so really focused on teenagers.
Yes.
And I think Tom mentioned it best when he said that I'm kind of the hallway counselor.
You sure are.
Yeah. So I have experience in crisis counseling and some biblical counseling training, but I really focus on just when kids are having a really rough day, maybe struggling, something particular that week. They come into my office and we can sit down and have a chat.
And I think that's so important to have, because what ends up happening is there are multiple layers of counseling and help available. And I think that intervention in the moment is, I think, super important. So I'm really glad you're here tonight to be part of this conversation. And so, Dr. Jeter, we'll ask you the same thing, and that is, what is your specialty and what do you bring to the table in that regard?
So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also teach at FSU in human development and family science. So in that department, we teach about family relationships, child development, adolescent development, kind of the whole span of human experience. Currently, I focus a lot on couples. So I do premarital marriage counseling. I also do what I call maybe divorce counseling, but really more towards like a positive divorce experience, nurturing parents through like a co-parenting experience and kind of thinking about their children's wellness like through that process. And so I've worked extensively with teenagers, but kind of have shifted my focus more to couples. I also have a background in working with teens who have eating disorders. And again, there was like a huge passion. I worked at a Christian eating disorder facility. So lots of experience with families and their kids.
You have seen a lot.
Yes.
You have seen a lot.
Yeah.
Austyn, how about you? Same question for you. What's your area of work in this?
So I work with teens kind of transitioning, I would say, out of high school and college students. That is That would be my favorite. I work with older adults as well, but that would be my favorite, just because they're going through so many life transitions and they're trying to navigate it, and it's just such an important time in their life. So with that, and then trauma as well. I have my trauma certification. So.
Right. And just I didn't mention your full name, Austyn Van Landingham.
No.
Van Der Linden.
Van Der Linden?
Yeah.
Did we get that right?
I'm
Okay.
so sorry.
No,
My
I was
bad.
gonna say, nope, you're good.
Austyn Van Der Linden. I'll make sure we get that right next time. So, well, I want to move us along because I have a question I want to throw out to the whole group, and we'll have some that are kind of individual in nature and some that are more a group, and anybody who feels like they want to jump in can do that. So the first question we want to talk about tonight is, what would be some of the common roots or common causes, for lack of a better term, for what we're seeing in the mental and emotional health areas today? What are some of the roots of some of those challenges, in your opinion?
When you say challenges,
Well, for those folks who are struggling with mental and emotional health issues, are there any commonalities to the roots behind those, and what's kind of causing? So we're looking kind of at that root issue cause question. Are there, or maybe their answer is there are none. Maybe they're all completely individual. That could be too. Yeah.
I can jump in if.
go ahead.
Sure. This may be a cop out, but I definitely I like the biopsychosocial spiritual model for like explaining any factors that that contribute to mental health, and I think it just captures all the different things that could be the root causes, if you will. So if you think from a biological perspective, right, you've got genetic factors, you've got other biological factors that are impacting the cause of mental health. But then you also have psychological factors, right? The different cognitive traps we get into, the stinking thinking that we all get into that contribute to, why we get anxious about the little things, right? But then there's also the social factors and the spiritual factors, right? So I think the same as it always has been, we've had all of these different components that contribute to the root causes of mental health. As I'll probably mention later on in some of our other questions, I think they just look a little different in today's day and age, as you can imagine, with the changes in technology and whatnot. But I think ultimately it's the same root causes, and they ultimately come down to how we do life with others, with our families, and how we ultimately deal with those difficulties in our own ways to try to get through those challenges.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that, Dr. Keezer. We appreciate that. Why don't we go on to the next question?
Yeah, so we talked about some of the root causes of the mental and emotional health issues. What are some of the most challenging mental and emotional issues that you guys are seeing? I'll let you take that if
Okay,
yeah.
So I will say, and I'm saying this in the nicest way possible, I see a lot of parents, they want to problem solve for their kids, and they don't allow their kids to problem solve or think critically about things, or try and experience resilience through adversity. And it is very challenging. I'll say as a clinician that's pretty challenging, but also just for the kids, they've got to learn these things, because when they get older, they've got to learn to do that on their own. And I know me as a parent, I want to protect my kids all the time, but the best teacher is social teachers, let them be with their peers and let their peers say man, you're not showering? What is going on? Pressure. Yeah, okay, you look a mess today, or your room's disgusting. I don't want to come to your house.
So when I'm chasing my son out the door saying, brush your hair, brush your teeth, I should just back off?
Well, to an extent, right? But it's one of those things where it's sometimes we have to let our kids experience things and experience the good stress. Sometimes people get confused. There's are kids in distress because they have in this exam? No, your kid's feeling eustress. That is good stress. It's going to motivate them. They're going to want to study and do well. So I think when parents, I'm including myself in that, we try to protect our kids to an extent. We're sometimes hurting them in the long run. So it's challenging.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, but I think it's important to bring up at this point, and that is, the question that always comes to mind is why? Why is that such a prevalent challenge for parents today? One of the things that's been talked about in some of our previous discussions is just this fear. There's a fear that either we're going to mess this up or we're going to mess them up somehow. So does that make sense? Can one of you guys maybe speak to that? Is that something you see, that parents are afraid they're just not going to do it right and somehow they're going to make a major mistake with their kids?
I think, yes, there's a lot of anxiety. I think today's parents are so much more aware of mental and emotional wellness than our parents were, like, lumping us all together. And so, I mean, I was very much a latchkey child. Like, I went home. There was no worry about, like, if I was worried about being home alone, right? It was like, this is your reality, walk home. I walked home from school in kindergarten, right? So I think there's like a fear, but I also think there's like maybe a little more generosity, some overcompensation, right? Like maybe we grew up having to do too much on our own, that now we're like, well, we remember what that felt like from a kid's perspective, and we don't want our kids to feel like they're out on this island on their own, having to like grow up too fast, be parentified, be spouseified, like all of those things. So now we're like overcompensating, and we're like, I'm coming alongside you and I'm gonna walk this path with you, and we're gonna kind of like, there's the helicopter parent, but there's also like the lawnmower parent.
Yes.
I've never heard of the lawnmower.
Yeah,
my God.
You push the lawnmower and you make the path so smooth and beautiful, like a rolling golf green. And so you lawnmower like along with them and be like, I'm gonna clear everything out for you. And I think that to some degree, it is like this balance between letting your kid know you were always there to like catch them when they fall, but also in my house, my phrase is figure it out, you know, especially with like an 11-year-old. I'm like, we have Alexa, we have Google, you have my kid walks to school, so he has a phone. I'm like, if your first resource is to come to mama for everything, no, and so I will redirect you and say, you can Google that, you can ask Alexa, you can look on your Canvas, and until you've done those things and tried to solve that problem and say, mama, I looked on Canvas, I can't find it. I Googled it, and I'm, okay, we're going to talk about what search terms did you use? You know, like, I'm still not going to give you that answer, because when you're talking about resilience isn't like problem solving in one step. Resilience is the characteristic of encountering barriers and hurdles and going over those to keep going, right? And so I think as a parent, especially the ones, you know, like me, I'm not speaking to anybody else here, who want to overcompensate, you do have to like push through that anxiety and pull yourself back and say, how can I just like back off 10% here and like maybe let them struggle with this a little bit.
And I will say, I experienced this, I've seen it before, but social media, like you have these videos of these parents like making these cute sandwiches for their kids or like healthy snacks. And I'm like, here's some muffins. You want a piece of pizza for breakfast? Okay, you're eating. Like right now, I'm just trying to get you out the door. So like not to comparing yourself to what you see on social media, because it's not real.
We're going to touch on the technology question in just a moment, but before I do that, Dr. Keezer, anything you want to add to this discussion about the challenges of parenting?
No, I just echo what everybody said for sure. And I think maybe I would add that I think kids can feel whatever our parents are exuding, right? So everything you've just mentioned, I think can come across as, you know, parents ultimately being anxious about doing the right thing. You know, it's coming from a good place in their heart, right? But that anxiety, you know, they might not say it, but it does trickle down, I think, to the kids ultimately. So even though they may be the lawnmower parent making a clean path, what they're ultimately learning implicitly is that, oh, like these are things to be avoided. Like I shouldn't feel, you know, stress, or I shouldn't feel anxious, and ultimately they might learn that, hey, comfort and safety is the highest value, for example, because their parents ultimately clearing the way and making it just so. So yeah, I just echo what everybody said. I think it's we're spot on.
Very good, thank you. So I do want to open the technology question. We spent a little time in the past in a recent podcast, and we had an event here talking about the role of technology, how to protect our kids from kind of the more nefarious side of technology. What we want to focus on tonight here is what has the proliferation of technology, especially personal technology, digital technology, what are some of the effects that you guys have been seeing in your practice? And it's not just kids, right? So whether you work with adults or kids, it's similar. So I was wondering if you could share with us some of your perspective on the technology part.
So I feel very passionate about this, and probably in a surprising way, in that I am not as anti-technology as maybe some people would be, because I think that radio was once a technology and people were like, radio is the devil, right? And then television, and then little Nintendos. Like, there will always be something in our sphere that will distract us from our relationships and God, like always, right? And for some people, it won't be a phone, it will be their job, right? Something that kind of masks itself as something like good. So I think when I look at technology with my children, I look at it as like a relationship with something outside of themselves that they need to learn to master. Because, I mean, this is my private hope, but my private hope is that my boys aren't playing like video games when they're grown men and dads or whatever, or maybe just for some occasional self-care. Like, that's not where I want them to get all their joy from. But my job as a parent is to teach them how to have a relationship with that thing, independent of too many like imposed parental restrictions, right? So I have boys. I think technology with boys plays a different role than it is with girls. I think technology with girls is very social. We know that boys are more physically aggressive, girls are more socially aggressive. So to be honest, I'm less concerned about social media. With my boys, they show very little interest in that, right? They want to play like Roblox and Fortnite and things like that. I think with girls, you know, I've heard they can be pretty brutal and ruthless with that. So, I mean, that's where my mind kind of goes, is like wanting to monitor how that kind of plays out in their everyday life. But you know, with my children, we have conversations about their privileges in life, and technology for them right now is a privilege, but it's also a necessity. Like, my kids they have to make PowerPoints, right? Like, they are just, they bring home a laptop and they're like, I have to make this PowerPoint and share it like with my teacher, you know? And so they have to learn to use this. And even in college right now, like with the AI, like we're actually encouraging students to learn how to use AI in like a boundaried way to help them with their papers, but not to be dishonest. So even in that setting, we're teaching young adults, how do you use it, but have like a good relationship with it? And so I say all that to say, like, it's not for me as much about the content. Yes, I monitor their content, but what's so much more important to focus on is their relationship with that, because that's going to translate to something else in their life, whether it's money or sex or their partner or their relationship with God. They need to be able to be self-aware and go, what is my relationship with this thing outside of me right now?
Yeah, it's so good. It's very powerful. Lorna, I think you wanted to say, maybe add something to that.
Yeah, and I agree that the relationship with technology is very important, and we do need to teach the kids that. I have a grown daughter and a grown son at this point, so we have gone through the technology fun with both of them. And I have found we struggled a lot with false thresholds. My daughter was a perfectionist, and so when she was scrolling through social media and when she was looking at different things, there was just, she found like this threshold, I guess is the only word I can think of, that she felt like she had to attain. And that became a very anxiety-producing thing for her because she felt like if she could not maintain that level of almost perfectionism, if you will, that she was doing something wrong. And so we had to really work through her with that and the technology. I would also say that I've met with several students who follow a couple of YouTubers who are dealing with mental illness, and it's not a good, healthy thing because those individuals, those YouTubers, are not helping people come out of the mental illness, not saying, hey, I struggle with this, but let me show you my hope. Let me point you to Christ. They're sitting in it and they're teaching others, they're teaching their listeners, their watchers to sit in it with them and maybe turn to things that are temporary reliefs to these mental illness. And so I really struggle with not having some control over social media and technology.
I'm glad you brought that up because it must be frustrating as a mental health or emotional health professional to watch all of the people in the United States and around the world who are like amateur psychologists. That's got to be frustrating at some level because, to your point, Lorna, so much of the stuff that's shared on social media is even I would realize, not as a healthcare professional, this can't be a good advice.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right now, the buzzword is narcissism, right? Like everybody's a narcissist.
Everyone.
Especially your ex.
Yep.
And I'm sorry to tell you, everybody's ex is not a clinically diagnosed narcissist, right? So everybody has some narcissistic traits, but not everyone's a narcissist. But it'll go, like, we have pop psychology and they go through waves.
The worst though is when they come in for an intake and they'll say, I watch TikTok and this is what I have. And I'm like, no, your daily functioning is not being impaired. Like just once every blue moon because you don't want to study for something does not mean you have ADHD or does not mean that you can't focus.
It's pretty much like any conversation that starts with, I saw on TikTok. And then whatever comes after that is probably not going to be at some level. It really is. Well, let's take a moment, and if we could, maybe we can steer the conversation a little more towards the faith aspect and just how that works. And so we got a couple questions around that.
Yeah, so Dr. Keezer, I'll direct this one towards you. As a person of faith, how would you talk about the role of faith in mental and emotional health?
Yeah, thanks for that. So first off, because I work in a secular setting, I'm surprised actually at how often people are still bringing their faith because it's so important to your mental health, no matter what your religious background is. And like even the APA has said, hey, this is an incredibly important component of what it means to be human, right? Your spiritual beliefs and understanding. So I think at the end of the day, it really informs what is my why for getting up in the morning and what's driving me towards my sort of like existential goals and end ultimately. So it's really great when you're working with someone who has strong beliefs in any religious background because you can talk about different cognitive distortions, different ways of getting into, like I said, cognitive traps, right? Working on that, but then ultimately coming back around to, hey, but this is your reason for getting up in the morning. Hey, this is what you're about, and kind of what you're driving towards at the end of your life. And folks that have that, I think, have a lot more resiliency and just a lot more stuff to fall back on when it comes to some of the core beliefs about themselves, especially like self-esteem, for example. I think is a great topic that comes up frequently in therapy. And so for people who especially are Christian, right, it's great to be able to come back around to like, hey, God says this about me as a person. I was created in the image of God, and that gives me inherent value because of X, Y, and Z. Like that's a really great theological truth to be able to integrate into therapy to help someone who might be struggling with their self-esteem. It's much harder to do that, I think, when when an individual, doesn't have any beliefs whatsoever to fall back on regarding their sense of self. We can say, well, you have inherent worth because you're a human, right? Well, I think religious faiths add a lot to that, for example.
That's good. Can you guys think of any spiritual, like research-based spiritual practices that might especially be helpful in becoming mentally and emotionally healthy?
I was just going to say, with my work with the kids, I see a lot of, I get to talk about faith and Jesus all the time when I'm talking with the kids, so this is awesome. But a lot of times they are just believing lies. And so going back to those biblical foundations of exactly what Dr. Keezer said, like, what does God say about you? And really, I talk to the kids about holding every thought captive. And so when they're starting to go down that road of being anxious or depressed, okay, what lies are you telling yourself? And let's stop that. We have to make a concerted effort to stop that train of thought and go, you know what, that is a lie, and replace it with the biblical truth. So really trying to focus the kids to do that.
That's good. That's good. Any other thoughts?
There is a professor actually in our department. His name is Dr. Frank Fincham, and he's like a world-renowned social psychologist who studies all kinds of things related to specifically couples, who's also a believer, and he studies the role of spirituality, forgiveness, prayer in couples relationships, and has found that all of those things, even when you're talking about not specifically Christian, but just more loosely spiritual based practices of forgiving or praying or meditating, they have positive impacts on your relationship. So there's lots of research to support that, having a sense of there's a higher power, but specifically, even within the Christian faith, that that is important for your overall wellness and your relational wellness.
One of the questions that comes to mind is I talk with a lot of people as well about a lot of these things, and for a lot of people, it's really hard for them to get in touch with what we're talking about. They know somehow that this is true in an abstract or general way, but they have a really hard time applying it for themselves. I don't know if you guys ever see that in what you do and how you practice what you're doing, that someone kind of knows the way it's supposed to be, but it's just not working. They can't connect to it. So is that something you guys see? Hey, I know I'm a Christian, so it's supposed to be working, but it's not, kind of thing. Lorna, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I see that in the kids all the time, especially, again, going back to those truths. They can speak truth over other people, but when it's spoken over them, they have a hard time believing it and receiving it. So.
I think that's fascinating that that's true. They can actually minister to other people, but they have a hard time receiving. Dr. Keezer, do you have something?
I do, yeah. I think also with both psychology and, religion, I think a lot of people get frustrated because, they're doing all the right things or believe all the right things. Again, whether they're doing the right, CBT, cognitive restructuring in their day-to-day, they're doing their deep breathing and all that stuff, or they're believing all the right things about Christianity, about their sense of self, or both, right? And then they're frustrated that it's not, quote unquote, working, as you say. I think a lot of that is folks' beliefs about what it's supposed to do. And definitely in our Western culture in the US, I think the belief is that, if I do these things, I will feel good, or life will be good in some ways, right? And so I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, is that, suffering still happens and still occurs. So I think, especially in a Christian sense, in our Western Protestant beliefs, we don't necessarily have a really good theology of suffering all the time in all of our church communities. And that's kind of an overlooked piece. And then when that piece is overlooked, I think that's when you see people struggling with ultimately suffering in their faith.
I think that's so important. Thank you, Dr. Keezer, for that. Just deciding what's normal, I think for a lot of people really is a hard thing to say that suffering actually, and learning how to your point, to learn how to lament in the midst of suffering. I think is a skill that many folks don't have. And that's unfortunate because all of the therapy in the world will not prevent you from suffering.
Right.
Just like all of the medical care in the world will not necessarily protect you from suffering. So it's a complicated thing.
So even if I'm a lawnmower parent, like my kid's still gonna suffer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Somehow or the
And
other.
that's okay.
And I will say, I just saw this on TikTok, so y'all consider the source.
Well, it must be true then.
But this young woman who's had small children said, I had the most amazing mother. She was emotionally available. She, cooked food from scratch. She showed up at all the things. She was amazing. And I am now in therapy because I'm a mom, because I can't live up to that.
Yeah.
So
you
that
do
was
it all right.
Oh my God,
You
yeah,
could be
my goodness.
too good of a parent and then torture your children like proactively in the future, right?
Yeah,
I was
wow.
going to say, just like the expectations. People have these unrealistic expectations of themselves and other people. They often put their expectations on other people, and it's like, that person did not agree to that. Like, that expectation you put there, they did not tell you that's what I could do or I can't do. So, I think that contributes to it as well.
Yeah, I don't think, I would agree with that. And I need to say this at this point in time, because we said this the last couple of podcasts, because it's easy to look at parents and say, y'all just don't get it. You're all messing up all the time. But the reality is, I would say that, and I've said this before, right? Parenting, especially in the 21st century, is very difficult. Yeah. There are so many things that make it so much harder than even when our kids were being raised. So many more external stressors, internal stressors, et cetera. So for all the parents who are listening, the object here is not to bash parents.
Yeah.
There are things that we need to learn as parents and grandparents to help make this better. But we don't want all of our parents to be so anxious about not measuring up to all the expectations like we're talking about. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'd like to shift gears a little bit more. I want to move towards, this is something I've noticed even in my work in lay counseling, if you will, that this expanding usage of terminology, like, the word, for example, the word trauma is used a lot within a lot of different settings, whether it's trauma, anxiety, depression. And I wonder what you guys might have to say about how you think about the various uses of those terms today. Anybody feel free.
Oh man, you're gonna put me on the spot?
Yeah. I'm looking at
Okay,
you.
so I go off of the clinical definition of trauma. People will say like, oh, this is an example. I've never had this happen, but like, this person was screaming at me, like my parents screaming in the house. Let's just use that. That was very traumatic for me. And I'm like, okay, do you have nightmares? Do you have flashbacks? Are you hypervigilant? Like, has that shifted your world belief about yourself, or like you can't trust people, or, and if the answer is no, I'm like, that was not traumatic for you. There's I go off the DSM. That is just, and I might be, okay, I'm glad someone else, you guys are like, yeah, it might be harsh. But
You're speaking my language.
yeah, I'm just like, it's like when people say I was bullied, and I know this is a hot topic, but it's like, okay, that person was mean to you. Like, I do this, my kid is 7. I have a 5-year-old and 7-year-old. I'm like, okay, that person on the playground was mean to you. They said one mean thing. That's not you being bullied. Or I was triggered by this. And I'm like, okay, you had all these big responses and you couldn't like regulate yourself. And well, no, it just made me angry. Okay, so you had an emotional response to something. Like, big difference. And I think people, again, it goes back to like ADHD. Everyone's like, oh, I have it. It's like, no. But I might be completely wrong. I mean, that's just how I look at it.
Even like kids will come in and say, I have anxiety. I'm like, no, you're anxious.
Yeah.
Just because you're anxious does not mean you have clinical anxiety. Just because you're sad does not mean you are clinically depressed.
Yeah, I think kids, they socialize themselves, right, from what's happening around them. So if they're hearing through TikTok, Instagram, their peers that they've got trauma and triggers and anxiety and ADHD, that becomes a language for them to use. And so I think as parents, and I've done this with my kids, we need to give our kids a more expansive emotional vocabulary, right? So some great resources that I wish every parent, I wish they gave them to you when you left the hospital, like with your baby in tow, like these laminated, they are the feelings wheel, Google it, write this down. The feelings faces is another one, or just a list of feelings words. And in fact, I would print all 3 of those out and teach your kids different words to use, because I will say this now, I have grown adults who I'm doing couples therapy with, and I'm not picking on you men, but men, when I say, how did that make you feel? And they say angry, and everything makes them angry. I'm like, nope. And then the next thing is, then the answer is, I don't know, right? Or they'll be like, I felt like I wanted to run away from my wife. And I'm like, that's not a feeling, that's an action, right? So, you know, wives are pursuing their husband saying, I want to know you emotionally. But if the husband doesn't know what he's feeling, that's a hard ask, right? So I think kids, when they say they're anxious, I'll say to my kids, you know what? Anxious can also feel like nervous. And it can also feel excited, you know? And my 9-year-old was like, Mom, I'm so nervous about something at school today, but it was like a joyful thing, an exciting thing. And I said, Caleb, I think you're excited. And then he was like, yeah, I'm excited and nervous, but like, because I didn't want him to just take on that label. So I think part of it is not like totally just shutting your kids down, but giving them like a more expansive range of like words and feelings to work with. And maybe even like, I really love teaching my kids about their bodies and like the somatic part of it. So like, where are you feeling it? Because even though I know where I feel my anxiety, it's like in my stomach, you know, and like I get all these knots and whatever, but I want to teach them to recognize the signs of their feelings and their bodies early, so that as they get older and are more accountable for their mental health, they can go, I know this is what anxiety or nervousness or a red flag in a relationship feels like to me. So now I'm going to be proactive and do a coping skill, or I'm going to tell this person my boundary, or, you know, whatever the appropriate action step is next, rather than being so disconnected from themselves that they're abusing drugs, or they are, you know, partying or skipping class and getting themselves in an anxiety spiral about their schoolwork.
It's almost like we're teaching them a new vocabulary to be able to express what they're thinking about. Dr. Keezer, do you have anything you wanted to add to that discussion?
Yeah, like I said, you all are speaking my language. You know, as a clinical psychologist, I'm so biased towards, you know, like I speak the DSM. That's my language all the time. So and you mentioned 2 diagnoses, especially, you know, PTSD and ADHD, that I think the normalcy of using the word, you know, little t trauma is what I like to call it, versus big T trauma, right? And, you know, having ADHD, right? I think you all talked about everything that I would normally say, but in addition to that, I think it also like waters down some folks that are, you know, the term, and it really does an injustice to the folks who are really struggling with those diagnoses, especially genuine PTSD, genuine ADHD. Like you guys had alluded to, like, hey, you know, just because you're not being able to pay attention to this, you know, in your day to day, you know, you've got a lot going on and you're losing track of things here and there, you know, that happens to all of us, right? But folks that are genuinely struggling with, you know, a neurodevelopmental disorder like ADHD really are struggling, right? Same thing with trauma, right? And very near and dear to my heart, I work a lot with people with PTSD, and someone with, you know, a genuine criterion A trauma is what we call it, right? Someone who's hit those categories in the DSM of experiencing a genuine threat to their life, right? It's totally different than, as you say, encountering bullying on the playground, for example. So I think it's really important that we're careful about the language we use, and it doesn't mean to not use those terms all the time, but it's important, at least as clinicians and as folks that are talking about mental health, understand the differences. So that'd be my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Let's go ahead, maybe transition. We'll talk a little bit about the availability of counselors.
Yeah, so well-trained counselors and psychologists, they're really hard to find in most zip codes. What are your thoughts about how effective online resources, online counseling are? That's just to anybody who wants to.
Kind of a loaded question,
Yeah.
but speak freely, because I think a lot of parents are, because it's hard to find enough counselors, they're asking those questions, so that's why we're
Their
asking.
only option.
I personally, I don't like it, just because I am a very hands person, and I feel I just feel like I can connect in person with people. And I also have this rule of Florida is so big, and I'm also licensed in Georgia, but I see people in Thomasville, right? Where I know I can get to them if I need to put them on a Baker Act, or if something, I can call law enforcement. I am not going to see someone in Miami. I don't know. That is way too far.
Because you can't tell what's going on in their situation.
Yeah, and each county has this different central receiving, and they do things differently. And so my rule of thumb is if you need to do a telehealth because you can't come into the office today, okay. But I need to know where you're at, who's at your house, are you in a place that's confidential? But other than that, but it is hard. But it's if you have to have that resource and you need therapy, what else do you do? Because you're right, there's long waiting lists here in town. So
Yeah, I echo Austyn. I think, I notice so much when a client walks into the room, and especially with couples. Today, one of my couples, one sat on the couch and one sat on the chair, which is very unusual for them. And the guy was like, my back is hurting. I just want to sit in a stiffer chair. And I was like, you saw me looking at you. But when you see a client come in, you see how they're dressing, how they're walking, their mannerisms. And
How
when
they
you're
smell.
on Zoom, how they smell, have they washed their hair, all of those. I mean, when I was working with teens, I could see, are they cutting, scars on their arms? And so you get so much information that's just visual, that during the height of COVID, and I was doing telehealth, counseling, and you just see kind of someone's face because they're holding their phone this far away. And I would say, especially with teens, they need the social skills, right? Of walking into a room with someone and not hiding behind a screen. I would say, like Austyn, if I have an established client that I feel is safe and has good boundaries, if they move to a different part of Florida and they say, I want to continue with you, I would be happy to. Or, someone traveling, I have a lot of, adult clients who travel, I'd be happy to do that. But I think that as much as possible, if you can get your child or your family into in-person therapy, I think that's the most beneficial resource, because there's so much lost in, translation when you're doing it on a computer.
And I'll say, definitely with my teens, I want to see them. I want to be able to get a feel for their personality. How can I relate to you? And I find it challenging to do that online. And not only that, but I want to know that you want to be here, because I'm not I can't force you to be here, right? And they too have to have their own autonomy and say okay, I see what I'm doing and I need to make these changes. And two, to see how they interact with their parents, and if I have other people, there's someone else in the waiting room, how are you interacting with that person? So it's big.
Yeah, boy, and I think we've touched on that. It seems the consensus seems to be building that one-to-one personally is much better. And you've also acknowledged that for a parent who's wrestling with trying to figure out how to get this done, and they have a 6-month waiting list for a counselor, there's just a huge tension there, right? I mean, it's just, it's very difficult as they're trying to figure out what to do. So you guys on the other side there have anything to say?
Yeah, I think to sum up what you all are saying, I think most therapists would say it is way better in person, not only for the patient, but even for the therapist. I know I echo the COVID times struggle where I had to do almost entirely, telehealth. It was entirely telehealth for a good portion of time, and it was draining and exhausting on the therapist end, right? And it just wasn't as good, and I think we all felt that. But I think from what I've gathered, at least in the few journal articles I've read on the topic, it still is good enough, though. And as you mentioned, there is such a need, and especially in like really rural areas, there's online therapy is good enough, and it should be on the table. It should be an option, and especially because it's just it is a luxury, and we need to be able to get it to as many people as possible, in my opinion. So.
So in a sense, this probably is a bad way to phrase it, but it's better than nothing. And maybe there are times and situations where that's not true. Maybe it's not better than nothing, but it could be. And for somebody who's desperate to get help, that might be a way to do it.
Yeah.
But I think maybe even more than better than nothing, like the question asked, right? It is efficacious, right? It does work. It does the job, right? I think everybody would prefer to be in person, but for many reasons, it's not available to everybody, and it should be an option.
Yeah.
Which I will say, though, making sure that the provider, I think we have a responsibility as providers, if we are going to provide services via telehealth, it is our responsibility to make sure we are up to date and we are best practice and knowing a client. Like I had a few years ago, it was during COVID, a trauma client, and because of what was going on and, the home, it was not conducive. It was doing, I don't want to say doing more harm, but it just wasn't. And I had to work with people, my trauma-focused CBT certification I had to work with that trainer, and how do I get through this? And I did 6 months calls But you have to do that as providers. We have to make sure we're doing best practice. And if we're going to do telehealth, we need to make sure that we are able, I don't want to say able, but doing what we're supposed to be doing to make sure that they're getting the best.
So what's a good question that a parent could ask a health provider, a mental health provider, to get at that question? What's a good question that they could ask someone to say, yeah, they get that, they can do that? How would you phrase the question if you're a parent?
I think asking, I'm listening to Austyn, and I'm thinking, I can tell, I'm going to use a general term here, not clinical, picky. She's picky. She has standards for what she's willing to do and not do. So I would say, tell me how you feel about telehealth, or you know what I mean?
Somebody would
Why, what is your philosophy on providing telehealth to teenagers? And if they're giving you a very lackadaisical answer, I'd be red flag.
Yeah.
But if they're no, these are the things that are important to me, and the things that she's saying, those are what caused me as anxiety as a clinician. I don't see people in Miami, I want to be able to be I know where your town is and could reasonably pick up the phone and know what to do there. So I think having a clinician who has a very clear set of standards for what they're willing to do and not willing to do versus someone who's well, I'll do whatever you want. No, that's not,
That's a red flag.
we are
Yeah.
in that sense, we are the expert.
Yeah.
We should be telling you what the appropriate standards of care are.
That's so good.
But to add to that, one thing I want to emphasize, and I tell this to all of my clients at the end of a first session, and especially when you're looking at getting a therapist for your child, what the research says is that therapeutic fit matters more than training and credentials and all this other stuff. And what that means is most of us are trained very well, right? If we have letters after our name and like we've passed the license exam and done our state like supervised internship, like we're vetted out to be able to practice. But if your child does not like their therapist and doesn't just like jibe with them, I would say you got to move on to someone else, because the therapeutic relationship is a model, or is supposed to be a model for a healthy relationship, right? And so they need to be like, they need to feel accepted. Like one of my favorite therapists is Carl Rogers, and like one of his big foundational tenets is what he calls unconditional positive regard, which as a therapist, like what I mean is I need to think the world of my clients. And I do. Like they can do some awful things, but I'm always like, you are wonderful in my eyes. And your child should kind of take that away from their therapist. And I know sometimes that scares parents because they're like, no, I want you to confront my kid and tell them like they're not making good choices. But they need that like love and that reassurance. That's like a fertile soil for them to hear, hey, maybe you're not doing and making healthy choices. So I would always refer back to your child. If you think they need therapy and they're like, I don't like my therapist, you don't say, okay, well, we're done. We just say, okay, we're going to find you a better fit. And that's really important.
Yeah. And being able, like as a therapist, if someone comes to me and says, hey, this isn't working out, or if I know it's not, I'll say, look, it's not going to work out. And it's not a dig to me. Like that does not hurt my feelings. I am so glad you advocated for yourself and for your child. Like I'm okay with that because I'm not for everyone. I know I'm a very like blunt person, or I'm very like, okay, I can be soft. But then I'm like, what is going on? What are you're having a day? Let's talk about it. Like but if you're like, no, that's not going to work. Like, say that. And that I think is huge, is sometimes we don't want to hurt people's feelings, but as professionals, that doesn't hurt our feelings. It doesn't hurt my feelings.
My analogy is I love ice cream, but I don't like all flavors of ice cream equally, right? So you can love the idea of therapy, and I don't want you to quit therapy because of me. I don't want to traumatize you, but please tell me. Like maybe I talk with my hands too much, or maybe I remind you of the girl who you sat next to in middle school who you couldn't stand. If my voice like gets under your skin, don't waste your time and money on me, and I will absolutely refer you to other people. No pride involved at all. You know.
Such a great conversation.
It really is.
I just think it's a great conversation. Please,
You might add that. Because I echo that. The relationship is the most important piece. But I think it's also, I know you guys would agree with me, one of the most important things too is that therapy shouldn't always feel good for the patient as well, right? So walking that fine line, you want a therapist ultimately who's going to connect well, be personable, be able to build that rapport and that relationship that is so essential, but they have to push the patient into a place where they can grow as well. And I know some folks might like critique individuals or just stay in the relationship. The relationship's great. Like we got this great rapport, and ultimately it's like a professional friend situation, right? So you really want someone who can walk that fine line. And I know that's just the perfect, picture, and that's not always the case for all therapists, but I think it's important to look out for that as well. Someone who's gonna challenge the individual too.
yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know I know I'm doing a good job when I have a client that gets like really mad in the middle of the session, or they're crying, and then it's like all these, I'm like, oh yes, I'm doing my job. And then they're like, all right, I'm done with this. And then I get an email like 3 days later, and it's like, we're still scheduled for this next session, right? I'm like, we are, I'll see you then, don't worry. But I'm like, yeah, okay, I did something.
Has some breakthrough going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think an analogy that I just used recently this week is it's like physical therapy, basically, for your ultimately your emotions, your cognitions, right? Like it's something that you're like, man, like this, I know this is going to be hard, but I'm going to go because it's good for me, right? Like, and you're going to work through some hard stuff, right? And so it's It's about having enough of a relationship, enough of rapport to get the person to keep coming back and pushing themselves a little bit further.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we're actually coming down to, we have a couple more questions, then we're going to go to the questions from the audience and some Q&A with that. But one thing that's very important from my chair as head of school, Community Christian School, is as Community Christian School is diving further into the emotional health realms and having these conversations and sponsoring these conversations, et cetera, what would be one piece of advice you would give people like me, like a school leader, as we wrestle with trying to care for students? Well, people like Lorna and I, for instance, what advice would you give us as we try to frontline kind of help?
So I think doing exactly what you're doing now. And I love school. That's why I'm still in school teaching students. I want to, every August, I'm like, school supplies. I love school. I love teachers. I'm pro teachers. When my kids come home and they're like, my teacher, I'm like, zip it. We are a pro teacher in this house. We don't, but that being said, I think teachers do an amazing job and they are frontline, but it's ultimately the parents' job, right? And I can't say that enough. And so I think for schools, yes, on a micro level, you have a student in a hallway who needs that support to just make it through the day. But I think schools supporting parents and families is so important, because you guys only get those conversations in those small moments, but it's what happens outside of school that really reinforces that. Yes. And I don't often have grown adults coming to me talking about school, right? Yes, they struggled in school or they didn't like school, but they are traumatized by how their parents responded to them. They are, they're traumatized about what happened in their home lives. So I think educating parents, encouraging them, lifting them up, praying for them, encouraging them to come talk to you and ask for help and support. That's what, I think is so valuable.
Yeah.
That's really good.
I would say in creating a space that parents can come together and talk about the things that are going on, because if my child's experiencing something, there's a good chance that someone else's child, and knowing that hey, we're doing this thing together. We're trying to figure, did that work for you? Okay, this didn't work for me. So what can we do? And being there and letting them know, you can have the difficult conversations. I think that's my biggest thing is parents, have the difficult conversations. Let's talk about these topics, definitely down in this area that are not talked about. Because that allows your kid to say, hey, I can talk to mom about this, or I can talk to dad about this, and they're not gonna have this big, huge reaction. Oftentimes our kids mimic, they see a trauma client, right? Their parent comes in and they're boohoo crying, something happened to their kid, and the kid's like, am I supposed to act like that? Am I supposed to be crying over this? So if we can have these conversations and know that hey, we can talk about this freely and openly, and it's nothing to feel shame about, then it does better. But it starts with the parents. It's supporting the parents and letting them know, you guys are doing a great job with the resources you have, and you're doing the best you can with what you got.
All right. I was having a conversation with a parent today, actually, at our pickup or drop-off, and we were talking about this idea that parents, I think, really need a critical mass of people who are like-minded and trying to figure it out. And there's strength in numbers. So when because a lot of parents, I think, feel like they're the only ones. They're the only ones that are trying to figure this out. When in reality, they're to your point, there's a lot of people, but they just don't talk openly because they're embarrassed or whatever the reasons are. But in reality, and that's one of the things we're trying to do with all this, is trying to connect people to say that you're not alone in this. Anybody want to add anything else? Advice for me as a school leader?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to, I think I had, when I was going over the questions, I think the first thing I wrote down was not doing it alone was what I said. Because it's so important that as a family system that you don't feel isolated and stuck in your little bubble struggling with whatever you're struggling with. But I think what I was going to say about school teachers, school leaders, and parents all combined. The encouragement that I have is that, you're the most important people for these kids. Your actions, everything you do, right? You're role models for these kids. We as mental health providers at best get maybe an hour a week with these kids, with these teenagers, and it's easy-ish, for us to be active listeners and have that unconditional positive regard for that hour, right? But you all get to do it every day with these folks, and I think it's just my encouragement is the reminder that it's such an opportunity to have such an impact in each of their lives, way more than our hour each week with them. And the stuff that we talk about, as therapists, it's not, I'm proud of what I do, but it's also not rocket science, right? Like unconditional positive regard, active listening, building that relationship with someone, it's challenging, but it's something that everybody can do as well. And so you all as teachers, mentors, coaches, parents, just have such a great opportunity to have a huge, wonderful impact for all of them, greater than we ever could as therapists. So that would be my encouragement.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. And I think that's really good to hear.
Yeah.
Because it's not easy. And I think knowing that it matters is a big part of that. So I think probably we should, if it's okay, maybe we can go to some of the questions.
I think so. We've got some great questions.
Okay, well, let's see what we can do here.
One of them is, how do you know if and when you need professional help or therapy? How do you know?
If you're not functioning, I was gonna say, like, if your daily life if you're just not functioning at what your baseline was, like if I'm not doing my activities of daily living, if I'm not getting up and brushing my teeth or my hair, or being able to do my job at work, if I'm not getting along with people, something big has happened. I say big, but some type of transition or something that has caused me to go like, okay, now I'm out of my routine. I'm out of what I would typically be doing. That to me is an indicator of
just not functioning.
Yeah, like you're
with daily activities.
Functioning is impaired.
Okay. Anybody else want to add something to that, or?
I have a very liberal standard, which is if you think maybe I should talk to someone, that is enough. I am in maintenance therapy for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
I will go to therapy until I'm, the day that I die. I'll miss that appointment, right? So I think that the value, our whole mindset about therapy, it used to be like you were going to lay on the couch and you had to be hysterical and have something really wrong with you. I view therapy in the biopsychosocial spiritual model is it's like one pillar to your overall wellness, right? So just like maybe none of us are going to go out and do like a fitness competition, but like walking for 30 minutes every day would benefit us, or like eating less sugar or whatever. Like we're not going to be elite, but if you think and this is how I use therapy, I want to have a therapist on file, just like you have a primary care doctor and you have a great relationship with that doctor. And you check in like once a year and get your labs done, right? And that's it. But then when you're sick and you're not feeling well, you go, my primary care doctor knows me. They know what I'm like when I'm healthy. Now I can call them. There's no anxiety. And I'm going to go check in with that doctor. And that doctor is going to do this great workup on me. That is like my idea for how people use therapy is maybe you meet with a therapist and be like, I just want to have a relationship with someone so that when I hit a wall with my kids, with my spouse, with my work, whatever it is, there's no anxiety about who do I call? Like how soon can I get in? It's I pick up the phone, I call my person, and they're like, I can get you in. And I tell clients, once you're my client, you're always my client, right? So I will do my best to get you in. But if you want to see me once a quarter, and then sometimes you see me once every 2 weeks, and sometimes we're in crisis and I see you twice a week. Like it does not matter. You utilize therapy how you want to do it.
That's good. Once you're my client, you're always my client.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one I have for you guys. how can I encourage my teenager to be active at school, raise hand, to answer questions, participate in discussions? The teenager thinks that it's showing off when he does that. But so the parents want to encourage him to be more involved.
I could see the teenager's point of view.
Right.
No one wants to have that kid in their class that's always answering. Like, no one wants to be sitting with Austyn because Austyn keeps talking. Yeah.
But there's the opposite end as well.
There is.
There's.
Well, I mean, this is personal experience, but yeah, I was that kid, and kids called me like the teacher's pet and know-it-all Nari. Like I have a nickname for that. Like, so I was senior like class teacher's pet. The one, like, if I could give every parent like a use-all tool for when their teen comes to them and says like, this is, something I don't want to do or whatever. It's just curiosity. Like, you don't have to have an answer. And I think parents feel that pressure to like, I have an answer for this. I have a cure for this. And so I think if that were my child, I would say, well, I'm curious. Like, why do you feel like that's showing off? Right? And they might say, well, because a friend said it was, or because someone else does it. And when they do it, I feel insecure. I feel like they think they're so smart or whatever. And so then I'll kind of lean into that. Well, I'm curious why you feel that way, or I'm curious why your friend would say that. And I think teens have said, and research shows, they feel shut down when their parents tell them how they feel or tell them what the right answer is. So the more you can just be curious, and my favorite response to my kids is, it's just like a very neutral, like, and I'm just like, like lots of different intonations of that. And I might say, oh, I never thought about it that way.
So you're just trying to get to like their true feelings about something, not your feelings being pushed on them.
Get them to just like give me, something to work with. And then so I might end with like, well, I'm curious on what might happen if you just tried it once, like I'm just curious about that. And I'm not asking them to do it. I'm not telling them to do it, but I am saying, hey, there's a possibility here, like somewhere in all of this. And so like, I say like, if you don't know what to do with your teen when they present something to you, I know what will absolutely shut them down is you telling them what to do, right? Or telling them how they feel. It's like brick wall. But if you approach with curiosity,
tons of questions.
Ask questions, just tell me why you feel that way. Tell me, what do you see your friends doing? Like, and I think you're gonna glean so much more from that and some possibilities there.
I'm just cycling through all of my conversations with my kids, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I think I have to call all of them tonight and say, I'm so sorry. I actually told you what to feel in that moment, and I need to I guess I have to own that somehow, because that could be a real problem. Let's go on to the next question.
Okay, and anybody can feel free to pick this one up. It says, praying away my sadness isn't working, but I feel guilty asking for help.
Wait, what was the question?
It's not really a question. It's just, what would you tell this person who's saying this? It says, praying away my sadness isn't working, but I feel guilty asking for help.
It's so hard because especially in a Christian setting, we do pray and we do tell kids to pray. And so what happens when they do pray and it stays the same?
Yeah.
And so I think talking about needing the community, and I mean, it's a team effort. It takes a village, right? And so being around like-minded people, and yes, asking questions, and if you're a kid, prayer's an aspect for sure, but
It's
there's
not
so
either
much
or,
more.
right? It's not supposed to be
so
either
much
or.
more to it.
Yeah, and I would say just if I had a client that came to me and said that, I would not even look at the spiritual part of it. I would strictly ask, like, figure out who modeled the guilt from asking for help.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
That's where I would start, right? Because the other stuff, like I mean, you have to be able to ask for help. Like you just have to. And that to me would be my starting point.
Yeah, that's good.
I would echo, getting back to like suffering, like it's okay to feel sad. And I think that's another thing too, that even I as a parent, like want my child to be happy, right? And I'll be like, why? Because it makes me comfortable, right? But I feel sad. Like I often joke to my friends, like, or people, I'll be like, my range of emotions in any given day is -5 to 13, right? Like I go through all of it. And I want my kids to be like, it's not your job to be like happy all the time, right? And that our pain and our sadness tell us something, right?
That's good.
Just like our body, if my ankle wasn't, if I was in pain in my ankle, if anything, that's going to drive me to go to the doctor. And the doctor's going to be like, you have a mass in your ankle, or your Achilles is like broken or whatever. Pain is a great teacher. It's a great indicator. And so I would say it's okay for you to feel sad. I would go after the guilt, right? Like that to me is feeling guilty to solicit help is a deeper problem than to me feeling sadness, because sadness is part of the human condition.
Right, you're gonna feel that. You're gonna, like, that is, you can't get rid of that, right? Like, I always tell people, it is unrealistic to feel happy all the time. How exhausting would that be? Like, I couldn't even imagine, but the help, the guilt for that,
Yeah, so good. Such good answers. Let's go ahead and grab another one while we can.
Okay. I think,
I'm sorry. Do you have something?
Sure.
Go ahead, Dr. Keezer. Sorry.
I was just going to add, to echo exactly what you're talking about with the first emotion, like that sadness, right? That's the primary emotion. And a lot of times it's the second emotion that we add on top of that. Like you're saying, the guilt or the avoidance around the negative feeling that ultimately ends up being problematic. But initially, like you guys were saying, I would have normalized the experience of that emotion, and also encouraged like how beautiful it was that that emotion brought them closer, or their initial response was, hey, I'm going to reach out to my God for this, right? That I'm going to pray because I'm struggling, right? And validating, wow, like that is, just such a beautiful thing that they did that. So that's all I was.
right there, like you just saying that was like, okay, them praying is asking for help in a way, like,
Right.
So.
That's true.
Good. That's really, really good. Excellent. Well, let's grab a couple more.
Okay, my teenager is mean to younger siblings. What do I do?
This never happens in real life, does it?
That's communication training, right? Like that, and the only way you're going to learn to communicate better is practicing it. So in my house, I have younger children. I don't have teens yet, but very early on, I would step in and say, I know you're trying to communicate something here, a boundary, a displeasure, a feeling. And I mean, I was firm, that's not an appropriate way to do it. And then I would model or give them different versions, and then I would make them say it. Which one of these feels like something you can say, right? So contrary to popular belief, we are not born great communicators, right? We are, to some degree, like lazy, and some of this is not very intuitive. And like when I married my husband, for example, I was not a great communicator, even though I was a couples therapist. So like I had to read a lot of books. And I also realized that like when I have a lot of feelings, I'm not a great communicator. So I had to learn like time and place and when to communicate. I also had to learn that for me to unlearn some of the negative ways of communicating, it wasn't going to happen in the moment. I actually had to write things out, like sit and journal and be like, how do I set this boundary in a loving but firm way? So I had to do tons of practice. So I say all that to say, like with children, they need practice, and it's not don't be mean to your brother. It's you are allowed to tell your brother to not burst into your room. You are not allowed to name call. You are not allowed to scream it at the top of your lungs. So we're going to find a way to say, it makes me frustrated when you burst into my room, without my permission. Yeah. Can you please knock next time before you come in? Okay, you heard that? Tell me what you heard. Now say it. Yeah. Say it right now. Repeat it. Because we don't learn through, a lot of times, passive listening. We learn through active engagement in the process.
That's very good.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I don't know how you guys feel about this. I am very much one, if we are going to talk it, we need to, as parents, we've got to model it, right? Like, it's one thing to say, like, oh, don't yell at your sibling, and then I'm yelling across the house. I will tell you, I am world's worst at that. I will yell across the house when I tell my kids, just go walk to their room, But, like, we have to model it, and I think that's super important. If, like, the modeling the communication within our home, and knowing too, like, our values. For me, one thing is always tell the truth. Like, honesty is huge in my household. And I said this when I did a training. I was talking to my mom a couple months ago, and my 7-year-old I was like, yeah, I'm cooking dinner. And my 7-year-old, you are not being honest. You have not cooked dinner yet. And I'm like, okay. I haven't started yet, Mom, but I'm about to. But I think it goes down to, like, the values you want to instill in your kids, and then, like, modeling that. And communication is a huge one. Okay, how are we going to be able to communicate how I'm feeling, identifying those emotions? Okay, repeat back to me what I said, so I know you're listening.
It's hard as a parent when you don't understand those things for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
To call them out in your kid.
That's good. Yeah, because I think every parent that I've ever known, including me and my wife, we all have a sense of what is normal. And a lot of that's shaped, I think, by what we grew up with. And I know in my particular case, my parents argued all the time, vociferously, all the time throughout their entire life until one of them passed away. And so when I first graduated from college and everything, I had to work through this. This is not normal. This is not okay to meet, when you don't understand or you're frustrated, you immediately, blow up or whatever. So I agree. From a personal anecdote, I think, there's that sense in which we have to grow and we have to learn. And it takes practice. It takes research sometimes. It takes being open for somebody telling you the truth about yourself, which is really hard, but I think it's very, very important.
I think sometimes people struggle. So when I went to therapy school, they told us nothing is normal, right? Because as a silly example, what people wore in 1700s colonial times would not be normal now, right? Like, so what's normal shifts with culture and time. I would ask the question, is this working for us? Yeah. Right? So even if it might be completely normal for some families to be loud, right? And yell, and it does not faze them. And I see that a lot in marriages, right? One family, like one person comes from a family full of yellers, and they yell and they say kind of maybe snarky, sarcastic things, and nobody skips a beat. And then I come from the other person comes from a quiet family who manages conflict in like a very, peaceful way, and they marry each other. They always find each other. And they will be like, tell us who's wrong. And I'm like, I'm not going to say who's wrong here. I'm going to say, is this working for you? And 9 times out of 10, it's not, right? So then the real answer is, we got to find an agreed upon set of rules. I call them fair fighting rules that work for you. So maybe it's not yelling, not cursing, not doing this, or leaning into these types of things. But normal doesn't always help to ask. If it's not working for you and your family, that's a good enough reason to change it.
And if it's not working for you and your family, it's okay to change it. And it's okay to say, like, my best friend's family does this. There are tons of people that I've seen that have associated like love and chaos. And it's like, okay, if that works for you, then that works for you. Like, who am I to say like that doesn't work?
So we're going to transition to the lightning round. And what that means is that we're going to try to get through as many questions as we can. So as the answers, we're going to kind of give the short take. and then we'll kind of move on. So let's go ahead and take another question.
Okay, are there ways to help my child with her ADHD without medication?
Very common question we get.
I can take that. Yeah, so the main things that they would say in the literature for ADHD without medication, because what they would say, what the data would say, medication for ADHD is the first line of treatment, but primarily reducing distractions is your main piece. So whether it's noise canceling headphones, canceling out all the extra tabs on your computer, silencing your phone, right? You want to reduce as many stimuli inputs, right? That's the number one, reduce distractions. And number two is to provide structure. And so whatever that means, whether it's scheduling, whether it's having an agenda, whether it's, as simple as like, I've got a big essay to do. Well, I need to outline it first, break it down into structure. Those are going to be your two go-to pieces there. Reduce distractions and provide structure.
Fantastic. Excellent. Let's go on to the next one.
Okay, if my child begins sleeping a lot, not hanging out with friends, refusing to go to school, says they're fine, but just want to be alone, what should I do?
That's my red flag. That's a functioning issue. There's a impaired functioning right there.
Okay.
So therefore,
So, hey, let's hang out today. Let's do something you like to do.
that's
And
good.
then we're going to call someone and make you an appointment. Someone you can talk to.
Yeah, because those things are just not good.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think people should be social.
Okay. All right, next one.
Okay, what are the signs of trauma? I don't know if that's
lot
too
of
broad of
them,
a
I would
question.
imagine.
You kind of said that earlier. Yeah.
Do you want to hit this one since I did it earlier? Yeah.
Avoidance is the biggest sign. So if a genuine trauma occurs, right, and then you start changing your life because of what occurred, in ways that are disruptive, right? I think that's the biggest indicator, and it's usually avoidance. It's like, I'm going to stop doing X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to go to these settings because it reminds me of the trauma, right? And then all of a sudden, your life gets very, very small, very, very quickly in a way to protect yourself.
That's good. Yeah, that's excellent. Okay.
Okay, are there circumstances when therapy is not appropriate for a child? There's a book called Bad Therapy that was referenced in this question.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Can you think of any?
No, I mean, I think it would boil down to like,
I might be able to add something to that, actually. Normally, I think we would all say therapy is good for everybody. And like we were saying earlier, hey, anybody could benefit from therapy. However, as far as children goes, right, if you're considering, right, therapy for your child, right, I would take a step back and ask questions if the things you're considering are purely like maybe things that are expectations that you have for your child. So where I saw this maybe is like, hey, my kid's not getting good grades, right? Like, I need to take him to therapy because he's not, like getting the grades I expect him to get, or he's not doing the sport that he always did and I expected him to do. That's where I would say as a parent, you might want to take a step back and ask yourself, hey, is this something that needs therapy, or is this something that we need to talk out first because it's like an expectation for me as a parent that doesn't necessarily have to be true for this child? That's where I'd come back to that dysfunction question. Is it dysfunction? Is it a problem truly? Or is it something that, again, is a difference in maybe values or just personality development?
And do I need therapy? Because why am I putting this expectation on my child, right? Like, is this something that I have not worked through and I'm projecting? Yeah.
Now we're meddling, that's what's going on there. But that's okay. That's good. Go ahead.
Okay, what are some ways we can best support our son's class, which has experienced significant loss in the last year?
Yeah,
Grief is hard.
grief is hard.
Because
I think we've mentioned somewhere that our school has experienced multiple deaths and within a 12-month period, and it has been very difficult in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And grief is different with everyone.
yeah, I think just talking about grief and like you said, grief is hard. That is like my catchphrase, right? Like, grief is unpredictable, right? And I think in the past, we've had this linear idea of grief, like that it's a balloon and over time it will shrink. but I've heard this like great analogy. It's about this, like the idea of like, you can look it up online, but like a ball in a box, and the box has a button, and that button is like the grief button, right? Like where you feel. And instead of looking at it as like the ball inside shrinks over time and just eventually will get smaller, it's more like a day-to-day thing. Like that the ball on some days is going to be really big, and it's going to, no matter what you do, it's going to move around in that box and just mash that button like all the time. And then other times the ball will be small and it'll be moving around in the box, but less of a likelihood to like hit the grief button, but the ball is always there.
Yeah.
Right?
So just have more conversations about it in the classroom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
give them something to work with. Yeah.
And I will say a couple weeks ago, I saw that Tallahassee, we just started and this might sound weird, a grief cafe. It's like a group of people that go and they just talk about death. Like like almost like a grief support group. But also too, for like the people that are aging, like, because it's gonna happen. We need to have this one of those hard conversations we talked about earlier. Like we've got to talk about it. So like, just talking about death and grief and all of that.
And that's probably not something that most Americans do well.
No.
We
Compared
are
to
a
other
death
cultures.
avoidant society.
Yes. Right,
Yeah, death
right.
denying
Yeah.
society.
Yeah.
And I think it scares parents too. Especially, it's very normal as your kids' brains develop and they can think about more abstract thoughts. They will start asking questions about death and loss, and start experiencing, like your kid might be like, I'm afraid you're gonna die one day, and you're like, wait a second, and you say, oh, I'm healthy, I'm fine, like all that, but they need to be able to talk about
verbalize.
those things, and it's very normal for people to want to have questions about death, you know.
And I was gonna say, and being open and don't shut it down. And it goes back to what we were just saying, that I just lost my train of thought.
Happens to me all the
I
time.
know.
Happens to me
And
too.
you had just said and I was like, oh, that is so good.
It'll come back.
It'll come back. That'll be good.
Go ahead.
Well, let's go ahead and take maybe one or two more.
Yeah, Ms. Wolfkill, you may be good to answer this one. Is emotional intelligence taught in high school? Do you know this?
I do. So yes, we actually talk a little bit about it in Hope class. It's the 9th grade. It's a required class, but we do have a whole section on mental health, and so we do talk about emotional.
Okay. Do you see other schools talking about that?
My kids go to Cullen Lakes, and I know they have a guidance on their special rotation, and on guidance, they will talk about like your feelings and eruptions, and like they bring home these worksheets and I'll read them, and like they're really cool. So I know in elementary school, at least where my kids go, they do some rotation where they're teaching about like emotional wellness and awareness of feelings.
Very good. Let's take one more, and then we'll have to close for tonight.
Yes, and this would be the last one, I think.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So it says, you said that you probably need professional help if you feel you need to talk to someone, but isn't that really just having a relationship, like a friendly relationship with somebody, like not necessarily therapy?
Yeah, listen, you're the one who said that.
So I think that most people who come to therapy, when they say they like feel like they need to talk to someone, have like legitimate things to unpack, right? I'm going to be honest, like I don't know, and I mean this in a loving way, I don't know a single person who couldn't benefit from some therapy. And it might be like processing negative beliefs about yourself. Yeah, like maybe you're an overachiever or a perfectionist. Maybe you don't take really good care of yourself. Maybe you're in a transition in your life. Like, I mean, I could take up another couple hours of all these maybe scenarios.
Yeah.
But therapeutic conversations are different than conversations with your friends, right?
makes sense.
And my guess is you probably have friends that you're talking to, and it's not cutting it. Like you're probably like, they're not challenging me, or they're like so pro me. So I definitely think, yeah, like I will say, I'm friendly with my clients, right? But I know I have a job to do when I'm there. So I show up, and it's intentional. And they get me for an hour, and all those things are going through my head of like, what do we got going on here? Like, what is not working for them? Where do I need to say to them, you are not doing a good job taking care of yourself, and we need to be more intentional this week about saying no to these things so you can say yes to some more self-care.
And for, if I can say this, for men, there's a lot of people that don't have the opportunity, they don't have a lot of friends. I mean, statistically, a lot of guys don't have a lot of friends, at least they can have those kind of conversations with. So
We do have one more question from the audience.
One more question, here we go.
So I don't carry a smartphone because I don't think it's good for my mental health.
There you go.
Okay.
But so I'm a Gen Xer, right? When I grew up and went to school, the playgrounds, it was crazy environment. Fights, rough, the language, the ideas that would be shared like crazy. You could imagine, right? But you're saying, well, kids are resilient, right? They're anti-fragile. It builds resilience, all that sort of stuff, maybe. But schools are a lot different now. And my question is it possible for a school or teachers to lean into the safetyism too much, or to do too much of the coddling or the hovering of a student? Or is that not possible? Or there's no risk?
Do schools coddle children too much?
I'm asking. That's my question.
Okay.
I might be able to answer. I don't want to preempt, but I think I would say that schools are caught between a lot of forces in our society, just in general. That we're caught between legal issues, insurance issues, and also just parents saying, because the majority of parents are not on that bandwagon. Most people are saying, don't have a slide because my kid might get hurt. And that's an exaggeration, but you get my idea. So I think for schools, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out a middle ground that makes common sense. But our bent, like at CCS, even though we suffer or we are challenged by those same forces a lot, and increasingly so as time goes by, one of the things we're continually asking ourselves, how can we do this better? Because ultimately, I think all of the literature, we're going to talk next week about the Anxious Generation book, Jonathan Haidt, and that's one of his main points, that kids are not being challenged. There's avenues of minor risk where they're not going to get really hurt, but it's okay for them to be challenged risk-wise in some ways, and free play and all that stuff, which we'll talk about next week. It's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer, but I will say that it's a challenging, getting that balance today is very difficult with a large group of people especially. So I'm not trying to cop out. I just don't know the full answer, except that we're going to keep looking at it and trying to do it better and better. So do you guys have anything to add?
I think that it would be hard to coddle children at a school, right? Coddling takes a lot of energy, right? Like a lot of investment. And I just think teachers, administrators, like you have to do so much. When I hear parents tell me that they feel like their children are being coddled at school, what I really see is that the parent is like, my child is being provided with something maybe emotionally that I don't feel like I can do, or that my child will not receive from me. So they might be like, my child's teacher is coddling them by like listening to all their problems and like giving them all this validation. And it's like going against maybe either what I believe or that like I don't know how to do, or my kid like acts like they hate me, so I can't even have those kind of like conversations or those tender moments. So when I hear parents say like, well, my kid's other parent coddles them or their teacher coddles them or whatever, I'm kind of like, what is it there to you that is curiosity? What is coddling to you? Like, what does that mean? That they get this special attention that maybe they're not getting from you? Well, what's keeping you from being able to give your child that special attention? It sounds like maybe something you want to do. Like, how do we get to that place?
That's very good.
Dr. Keezer, did you have something to add?
To add to that too, I think it's such a complex question, because when you think of when you ask the question of, and hopefully I got the whole question, but when you think of school, right, you're talking about an entire, like, what is it, like 12 years of developmental growth. So, our approach to social emotional learning should, adapt to that developmental growth over time. And I will say that then hopefully, right, as we get into like middle school and high school, there is more challenge being given to kids. And I don't spend enough time in the school system right now to know what that exactly looks like. But I think that would also be my kind of follow-up question as well, is what age group are you looking at? And what does coddling look like? Is that and what's the main problem there? I think the only thing that I could see in today's climate maybe being problematic is any collusion and avoidance of hard feelings, like we were talking about earlier. I think that's when it can sometimes get on the extreme end, where we're all of a sudden creating a sort of an implicit value around comfort, around not being okay feeling stressed or anxious, right? And like we've been talking about throughout this, the real goal is to be able to identify your emotions, identify what anyone is feeling at any given time, and have a helpful response to that. But yeah, whenever systems, I think, create an implicit message that some emotion is wrong or shouldn't be felt, or we should make sure people don't feel distressed, right? We can't avoid these things entirely, and that's when it can maybe be a little bit unhelpful.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to say, you had said when you grew up, like, people were fighting and calling each other's names and all that, and does that build resiliency? No, it doesn't. It makes you, I have seen, it is like, okay, get over it. I went through this. Resiliency is knowing, like, this is something that's super hard, and I have belief in myself that I can work through this problem, and I will figure it out. So I think those are two different things, and I think that's important to know. Like, it could be, with that situation, it could be like, okay, you're having issues with your peers. How do I work through this being uncomfortable and talking about that? That could build resiliency. But the physical part of it, that doesn't build resiliency. I don't know if that answers your question, or like.
No, I'm certainly not arguing to go back to that era.
No, but I think.
It's a great question.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a common.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Mr. Argersinger was talking about, what's that bound?
Yeah.
And then we're talking about definitional things. What is coddling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But I think sometimes at least when I grew up, my parents were like, come on, you didn't have it as bad as I did. Well, no, I didn't. Thank you. Like,
Yeah.
But I think we, in our minds as parents, sometimes go, I went through this. My child should be able to get through this. Mm-hmm. But it's completely different. Yeah, completely different.
Mm-hmm. And just want to point out, too, that the CCS does have the leadership program, which really introduces a lot of managed challenge and managed risk for kids in middle school and especially in high school, which they don't get really any other school that I know of. And so we are being intentional about setting up circumstances where they can grow from some of those things. So I think that's important. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation.
It has. Thank you all so much.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
really
Thank you
enjoyed
guys so
this.
much for coming and participating in this. It's been incredible. So grateful. I want to close us before we close our whole thing here with a scripture. One of the things I remind myself as we have these conversations, that I believe that God wants us to be whole people. And he wants us to be integrated, physically and mentally and emotionally in all of those ways. And so I'm going to share, actually, these are the theme verses for this year for CCS. And this is out of 2 Corinthians 4. And it says, for God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. Now we have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. And all of the brokenness I see on a daily basis, you guys see on a daily basis, is a reminder that the world is a broken place. but it isn't the end of the story. There's another chapter to the story to come, and at one point, God's going to make everything right. So next week, we're going to talk about
Anxious generation.
Anxious generation. Very good. That's great. So we're
That'll be
looking
good.
forward to that. And like we always say at the end of every podcast, if you forget everything else that was said tonight, remember that Jesus is Lord. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Gospel Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida. You can find us online at myccs.org.